architecture in the St. Fox School of Design and Visual Arts, together with Meredith Malone, Associate Curator at the Kemper Art Museum. I am the organizer of this evening's panel. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event tonight and also to introduce our panelists in just a minute. This panel is presented in coordination with the exhibition titled Tomás Saraceno, Cloud Specific, now on view at the Kemper Art Museum until January 9th. The exhibition and its associated public events are supported by the iCare Institute here at Washington University in St. Louis, and actually many of our panelists are former or current recipients of the iCare's research funding, as well as by the Graham Foundation from Chicago. We gather here tonight to reflect upon the possibility of a sustainable future in its broadest sense, prompted by some of the questions raised in the cloud-specific show by Tomás Saraceno here at the Kemper Art Museum. If you attended Saraceno's talk a few weeks ago, you may remember that he himself defies any possibility of defining the very word sustainability. Yet we are here tonight to reflect as architects, scientists, and scholars on one of the most prevalent themes in contemporary culture, that of sustainability, in light of his polemical work. As an artist, Saraceno is internationally recognized for his inflatable sculptures, fantastic architectural proposals, and environmental installations. Initially trained as an architect in the 1990s at the University of Buenos Aires, he actively pursues a research-based practice that synthesizes art, architecture, engineering, and natural sciences. Through this practice, he aims to build on the capacities of these diverse fields in order to envision alternate ways of being and inhabiting the world. Driven by a belief that the most significant innovations emerge not from within singular disciplines, but by working across realms of expertise, his experimental ethos is founded on a creative and agile culling of knowledge from disparate conceptual and disciplinary fields. In many ways, the dialogues he enters into and ideas sparked by his research-based practice are as much a part of his work as the art objects and installations he produces. It is in the spirit of Saraceno's cross-disciplinary approach. Tonight's panel will pursue some of the conceptual concerns posed by his visionary artistic practice, including an investigation into the scientific, cultural, and aesthetic dimensions of sustainability today. We have a distinguished group of participants this evening from fields including art history, architecture, literature, engineering, and biology. In a moment, I will introduce them in the order of their presentations tonight, but first, I would like to explain the format for this evening's discussion. Each panel member will present a very short paper, very short being 5 to 7 minutes, we may let it go a few minutes over, up to 10, in which they discuss their current research and how it relates to larger questions of environmental and social sustainability. At the end of all the presentations, our respondent, Dr. Eric Mumford, will offer his thoughts and start off the first round of questions to the panel. After about 20 minutes, we will open the floor to questions and answers from the audience. Finally, I would also like to invite you to a reception immediately following the panel at the Mildred Kemper Art Museum, where you can enjoy some refreshments and see the exhibition and enjoy one of the inflatable structures yourself. Just remember, one person at a time, just in case. The panel members tonight are Meredith Malone, Associate Curator at the Mildred Kemper Art Museum at Washington University in St. Louis. She completed a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Art History, a specialist in post-World War II art practices in Europe and the United States. She has curated and co-curated several exhibitions, including Cosima Bomboni, Character Appropriation in 2011, Power Fields, Explorations in the Work of Vito Acconci in 2008, and Chance Aesthetic in 2009, an exhibition examining chance as a key compositional principle of modernism. Most recently, she curated the exhibition Tomás Saraceno, Cloud Specific, which is currently in view at the Kemper through January 9th, as I said. She's also working on a forthcoming exhibition of minimalist, conceptual, and post-minimalist drawings to be presented at the Kemper in 2012. Joe Jazz received his BS degree in biochemistry with an English minor from Penn State, his PhD in biochemistry and molecular biophysics from the University of Pennsylvania, and was an NIH postdoctoral fellow at the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. Before joining the biology department in 2008, where he is currently an associate professor. He was an assistant member and principal investigator at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center here in St. Louis, and a scientist at Kosan Bioscience in Hayward, California. Lutz Koepnick is a professor of German film and media studies and comparative literature, and the chair of the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures at Washington University in St. Louis. He has published widely on film, media, visual culture, new media aesthetic, intellectual history, and German literature from the 19th to the 21st century. His current book projects include On Slowness, Toward an Aesthetic of Radical Contemporaneity, and Notes on the Long Take, Toward a Wondrous Spectator, a book investigating the representation of time and duration in international art, cinema, and video art today. Before joining the faculty at Washington University in St. Louis in the fall of 2010, Professor Brent Williams completed his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, then served as a postdoctoral scientist at the University of Minnesota Particle Technology Laboratory, and also at the Center for Aerosol and Cloud Chemistry at Aerodyne Research Incorporated in Boston, Massachusetts. His work focuses on the exploration of the composition, chemistry, and dynamics of Earth's atmosphere. He has helped to develop several novel atmospheric sampling instruments and has deployed this instrumentation in multiple large-scale international and domestic atmospheric studies of urban and rural pollution, and long-range transport of pollutants. Finally, let me say a few words about myself. I'm the director of undergraduate programs in the College of Architecture at Washington University in St. Louis. My scholarly work centers on the relationship between architectural education and practice in late 20th century. My recent publications include a co-authored book on Bertrand Goldberg's Marina City, as well as several essays on the pedagogical work of Alvin Boyarsky in North America and Europe, who was perhaps one of the most influential educators in the 1970s and 80s. Our respondent tonight is Dr. Eric Mumford, Professor of Architecture, Art History, and Director of the Master of Science in Architectural Studies program in Architectural History and Theory at Washington University in St. Louis. He has published and lectured widely on the efforts of modern architects to shape urban development, and his books include The CM Discourse on Urbanism, Modern Architecture in St. Louis, and Defining Urban Design, CM Architects and Formation of a Discipline. His current academic projects include American Architectural Culture since 1945, a textbook on the history of modern architecture, and several forthcoming scholarly essays. With that said, I would like to welcome our first speaker for this evening, Meredith Malone. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. I also just want to extend my thanks to all of our panel members for being here tonight and for participating. So, I think what I am going to do tonight is really kick off the panel to try to briefly lay out some of the key aspects of Tomás Saraceno's experimental works. And additionally, some of the sort of the more conceptual and the practical concerns that are posed by his visionary project for an ecologically sustainable city in the sky powered by solar and wind power. So the building blocks, I would like to say first, are Saraceno's floating metropolis. And this is a rendering that you can see here. If you haven't already seen the exhibition, it is open late tonight, and we are happy to invite you over after the talk. This is a large-scale collage that he has created specifically for the exhibition that you can see on the back wall of the show. So the building blocks, again, what I say, are these sort of mobile modules. What he calls his airport city or his cloud city. These modules are conceived both as highly adaptable shelters, and also transport vehicles for global migration that would theoretically be capable of stretching human relations, connections, and networks across space without border restrictions. Now, Saraceno draws inspiration from adaptable, lightweight forms found in nature, including clouds, including bubbles, and spider webs. And his cluster communities would theoretically be capable of changing form and sort of merging with other platforms, just as the same kind of capabilities as a cloud would even come together and disperse. And I brought in a quote here just to say, as the artist sort of explains of this project, he says, With more than half of the population of the world living in cities, billions of people traveling every day, and millions of pieces of data flowing, Airport City symbolizes our capability to ease the pressures we are putting on the planet's ecosystem by thinking toward a more sustainable future as far as living, communicating, and traveling on Earth is concerned. Now, and this is an installation shot from the exhibition, which has been on view for almost 2 months now. And going through and just sort of walking through the exhibition with people, I have heard a whole range of engaged responses from visitors upon first entering this really fantastical installation, which, as you can see here, is filled with this sort of intricate constellation of spheres and lines and points of support that sort of branch out all throughout the space on sort of this architectural scale. And some of the inquiries range from very pointed sort of logistical questions. People want to know, how would you go to the bathroom in a structure like this? They want to know exactly, how it's made and what his intentions are. But there are also more theoretical considerations that come up, such as, how are we to understand in more specific terms the relationship between Saraceno's nomadic city and our contemporary conditions? What kinds of social relations and behavioral practices would these pods sustain, and what would be rejected? And one of the most popular questions is this artist serious? And it's this last question that I really wanted to focus on a little bit for the last few minutes of my allotted time, because a simple yes or no answer really, it just won't do. And I want to start by saying that Saraceno's work, this is not a question of pragmatic solutions to pressing issues such as overpopulation or overdependence on non-renewable resources, but rather speculative proposals for an imaginative alternative to the reality that exists today. That being said, however, Saraceno is acutely interested in actually constructing and testing aspects of his floating metropolis. So, taking a step beyond mere playful possibilities or conceptual conjecture, he actively produces a range, as you can see this in the exhibition, a range of drawings, a range of collages, inflatable structures, and experimental models that can be physically experienced and tested. His ongoing investigation into the production of large-scale, inhabitable structures provides a good example. With works such as these, Saraceno invites visitors to experience a glimpse of his experimental aerial metropolis. And here I'm showing you a work, an installation from 2006. This is titled How to Live Together. This was shown at the Sao Paulo Biennial. And it's made up of three room-sized inflatable spheres forming a tower in which people were invited to sort of climb in, climb up, and in each section you could just lay down. And the idea is that you would feel like you are floating sort of on a cloud. He's created different variations on this idea over the years. Here you can see a work that was at the Hayward Gallery in London in 2008, where he's taking this sort of geodesic kind of dome construction, and he's splitting it in half. There's this PVC layer right here, so you could either enter into the top of the dome, like these people are, and sort of roll around, or you could enter into the bottom through a pressurized door system and look up and see these people floating above your head. He also, in 2009, another variation on this, you can see this was in, this is a work called Biosphere 1 from the Stopford Museum in Copenhagen, and you can see here that not only does he create, he does variations on these bubbles, but he also experiments with different kinds of cladding. And you can see here, he's very interested in different types of these sort of rootless plants that don't necessarily need to be grounded in dirt, but can get their nutrients from sort of the wind and the rain. And then most recently, these are two projects that he just created this year. This is an image from Berlin, an exhibition at the Hamburger Bahnhof that is up right now called Cloud Cities, and you can see here it has about 20 of these interactive bubbles that are all clad in different kinds of plants. And then this is an installation shot from our exhibition here at the Kemper, where he created this new structure called One Cloud Model, where you can see he's sort of experimenting with a different type of geometry here. This is a 14-sided polyhedral configuration. Again, it has like a split here, you can enter it and again feel like you're sort of floating on a cloud. But here you see he's adding a new element. This is the first time he's used these, which are these large solar cookers. In all of these structures, The behavior and the movements of each participating individual temporarily affects the position of the others. And for Tomás, this is really a demonstration of what he sees as a system in dynamic balance. Interactive installations such as these, in my mind, offer up an experimental platform within the realm of art through which we as visitors might experience ourselves and our being in the world differently. Saraceno's fantastic structures, while visually arresting, are thus not intended as concrete blueprints, but rather as performative platforms that provoke more questions than answers. But his visionary or sort of speculative approach does stand in distinction from other activist or what you might call interventionist strains of contemporary environmental or eco art, which are often focused, like a work by Marjanovic, Koepnick, which are often focused on humanitarian problem solving and the improvement of environmental squalor. And I'm using this just as this is a very big topic, and I'm just giving you one example here. What this artist does, she's an artist and an architect from Slovenia, whose work is expressly concerned with sustainability issues and local infrastructural needs in developing countries and impoverished communities. And in 2008, she proposed and built this in collaboration with an Israeli architect named Liat Esikov. This is called her dry toilet. This is an ecological toilet in the La Vega neighborhood in Caracas, a district without access to the municipal water grid. So, as one in a series of community-focused, on-site projects, her dry toilet attempts to improve the everyday conditions of those living in poverty by offering low-cost, sustainable solutions that can be implemented and constructed by the residents themselves. So, works such as Koepnick's actively join together art, activism, architecture, and design, and in the process, they worked to destabilize and reinvent sort of the place and function of art today. Now, while Saraceno has much in common with Koepnick on one hand, engaging in a similar sort of investigatory and interdisciplinary practice, his notably anti-pragmatist approach follows a legacy of fantastic projects emerging out of experimental architecture and utopianism. And I won't say anything about these. I think Igor might address some of this a little bit later, but here I just wanted to point out two of the theorists and sort of comprehensive designers that he talks about a lot, looking back to Buckminster Fuller. You can see this is his project for Cloud 9, which include these large tensegridy spheres that would theoretically have thousands of people living in these bubbles above the ground. And also, Friedman and his spatial city. Both are projects that were proposed in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And I just want to conclude by saying that so Tomás's future-oriented practice is notably premised on a rather hopeful ideal of globally shared ethics of living. As we continue to move away from a world of national communities into global networks, his projects encourage a heightened recognition of our interconnectedness, our togetherness, and our capacity to act as responsible and accountable agents. By constructively working within the space between pure imagination and science, between the poetic and the practical, he stretches possibilities beyond the immediately attainable, inviting us to leave behind ingrained limitations of how we see the world and each other.
So, I'm not used to thinking in an artistic sense. Being a biochemist, I tend to think more in molecules. But what I really want to try to, sort of my objective here is to get you guys thinking in terms of science and art not being that different, and the fact that sustainability, in many ways, isn't just a buzzword for scientists. It's actually a motivating factor for a lot of work that's going on, both in engineering, biology, chemistry, environmental studies. So my title sort of plants as chemists. So I'm thinking from atoms into the environment. And really that's kind of the take-home message of what the work in my lab tries to do. So this is a field of canola. Basically, if you've ever cooked with vegetable oil, this is what you're cooking with. But in that field is the innate ability to use molecules to create new molecules, and trying to figure out how to harness that power to make new biomaterials, or materials that are ultimately usable as fuels, is becoming a very, very major driving force in a lot of different science fields. So thinking about sustainability and sort of what motivates, scientists, right? It's essentially the same features that motivate artists. So if you think about a morning glory, so Georgia O'Keeffe painting this picture, right? Flowers, plants, landscapes, classic artistic feature, right? A lot of people start painting very simple pictures of what they see in their garden or outside. But the same thing that motivates an artist to think about this is exactly the same thing that motivates a chemist to ask the question, why is that blue, right? Why isn't this red like a rose? Why isn't it yellow like a daffodil? And ultimately, that motivation drove chemists to sort of figure out, okay, what are the compounds that make up, the pigments that make this blue? And ultimately, right, so this is probably, sadly, the summary of about 100 years' work. It's this molecule here, this anthocyanin, that contributes to part of those pigments. If you've ever grown hydrangeas, right, you'll notice that hydrangeas will be different colors depending on different soils. It's because you're changing the pH, which changes the charge. So it sort of demystifies a little bit of the beauty, but there's a motivating factor. But that same pathway kind of motivates people to go back in and think about the proteins that do all these manipulations. And they're really exquisite manipulations. And I want to ask the audience, so how many of you have ever taken erythromycin? Chances are if you were born, you had erythromycin eye drops. So antibiotics, a lot of anti-tumor drugs, the chemistry for making this molecule is essentially identical to what's used for antibiotic synthesis and other microbial syntheses, and also a lot of plant natural products. So sort of going from a very basic, this is pretty, you figured out the colors, there's actually a practicality to understanding that. So my lab is actually very focused on molecular structure, so the architecture of proteins, basically the nanomachines in our bodies, in plants and microbes and fungi, that do really interesting chemistry. And our particular interest is thinking about how you can, at the basic level, right, how do these little subtle changes become biologically relevant? But ultimately, if we can sort of figure out how these machines work, can we make them better? Can we actually improve a plant's ability to fend off a pathogen? Can we improve a plant's ability to survive under water stress or be more nitrogen rich? And if you think about a lot of the challenges, we're crossing the 7 billion person line this year, and probably 9 billion in a few years, well, depending on how you want to view this. Right, so thinking about in terms of agriculture, right, soybean, for example, how do we make crops more efficient to feed more people? How do we deal with plants that are going to be undergoing a lot of water stress, not just from climate change, but from water use issues as more people start to move into cities? How do we start to think about using plants as environmental cleanup tools? And that's actually one project in our lab. So I was not trained as a plant biochemist. My background is much more biomedical science, and I sort of drifted into the plant world because I like the proteins, and plants do things that mammals don't do. So for example, if you think about human activities since we became industrialized, right? We have put tons of organic pollutants into our environment. This is a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon. If you've ever smoked, if you've ever eaten barbecue, if you've stood by the exhaust of a car or a chimney, this is a potent carcinogen. But the thing to keep in mind is something like this can decompose over time. But also as we've industrialized and made cities and changed the environment, we also start to move around things like mercury, arsenic, lead, cadmium, so heavy metals. And the thing to keep in mind is there's a really major difference between, you can clean this up because you can find things in nature that can break this down and decompose it. Mercury is always going to be mercury. So, a really big question is, well, how do you deal with toxins in the environment that you can't change? And so one idea is basically to use plants as environmental cleanup tools. So in my group, we actually study a lot of different pathways that are all tied into how plants make compounds that protect themselves against toxic environmental toxins. But because we also have this very molecular focus, can we look at the proteins that are naturally occurring in a plant and re-engineer them to be better, and then put them back into the plant to improve the plant's ability to pull metals out of the environment as a potential cleanup tool? And this is an example of that. we were actually able to take a gene from this plant, Indian mustard, which is actually used in California's Central Valley to clean up selenium contamination from irrigation. So there's a classic example of, so most of our agriculture in California is all through irrigation. If you didn't have irrigation networks, you wouldn't have food. But you leach minerals and different metals into the soil. And it was anecdotally known that if you had problems as a farmer, you planted a crop of Indian mustard and next year your crop yields came back up. Because this plant will basically accumulate in the metal, and you cut it down and get rid of it, you're actually removing the metal from the soil. So we've actually been able to re-engineer one of the proteins from this plant and put it back in, and you can actually have versions of the plant that are now much better at dealing with this and are able to remove more metal out of the soil. So just one example to get thinking about in terms of learning from nature and actually trying to deliver on the promise of a more sustainable future. But the other thing to keep in mind is, I'm a biochemist working on this one protein to try to figure out how this works. This is a plant, right? A plant like us is a system unto itself. And so there's actually a lot of labs around the world working on trying to figure out how metals work on this. But even if you're successful, you're still going to have to talk to engineers to figure out how to use this system. You're going to have to talk to ecologists to figure out, where do you plant it, how do you plant it, how do you work on it. And this gets at one of these ideas that Saraceno tries to bring out, this interdependence of different fields to actually achieve a much greater goal, and sort of to inspire us to be optimistic and think about ways that we can actually improve the environment and walk towards sustainability. And I want to leave everyone with just one very basic thought. So Jack Schmitt is actually sort of a childhood hero of mine. He was the only Apollo astronaut who was a PhD scientist. All the other guys were test pilots or engineers. He was a geologist, and he went to Apollo 17, on the Apollo 17 trip to the moon. And basically, when he was on the moon, he was so into digging up the moon rocks. I can't remember who it was that was with him, but said, "Jack, look, the Earth is rising over the moon." And Jack said, "You've seen one Earth, you've seen them all." Right? And he went back to digging rocks. But that little statement really becomes something, to think about in terms of what our mission as both a society, as scientists, as engineers, as artists, as politicians, you name it, whatever we do, is this is it. And we have to make do with what we have. With that, I'll stop there.
Hi. I want to thank Meredith and Igor to put this together. Actually, it's a wonderful opportunity to have a kind of cross-disciplinary conversation that we rarely have. And I must admit, I don't think I've ever given a talk right after a chemist, a biochemist. With the one exception, my father was a chemist as well, and that was always a very good conversation. So I can make better today. In my comments today, I want to focus on three interrelated issues that I see at the heart of Saraceno's work: the concept of mobility, concept of utopia, and the concept of our panel today, sustainability. My central concern in my comments is less to ask whether Saraceno's curious merging of engineering, architecture, art, and science, his sort of integration of research and playfulness, really provides successful answers to these issues. I'm not sort of in a position to answer those kind of questions, but what I want to do instead is to ponder a little bit about the kind of questions that his work raises, maybe more in sort of the terrain of intellectual history. I want to use his work a bit as a laboratory to think through some of the questions that inform contemporary discourses and calls for sustainability. So I start with the concept of mobility. Modernity, sort of our modern age, is largely associated with an increase of physical mobility, the way we desire and allow ourselves to be transported to other places. While it would be foolish to deny the long history of forced displacement and exile as a constitutive element of modern mobility, much of modern mobility was also coupled to a hope for social upward mobility, travel around in order to get improvement of your life. As a result, we have come to build huge transportation networks and tools of vehicular traffic, whose sheer expenditure of energy today makes them no longer appear sustainable, let alone the way in which we have come to destroy physical spaces and ecological environments in order to enable that sense of mobility and transport. This modern or modernist culture of ceaseless transport and progressivist notion has also led to what I understand a very narrow notion and concept of mobility, one that mostly understands movement in terms of moving along a very well-defined trajectory from point A to point B in the most direct, the most efficient, and of course the least time-consuming manner. I find it difficult to imagine a future in which we give up our thirst for other places. But Saraceno's work, in my understanding, asks us to complicate our understanding of what it might mean to be mobile in the first place. Works such as Airport Cities invite us to be playful, to probe our own sensory systems, to actively move around, but they also make us probe the impact of our movements on those of others, and vice versa. And when Saraceno was here, very nicely talked about the work on the right as sort of something where I make a step, and by making a step sort of impact the step of someone else in these very fragile structures in many respects. I guess here in the Kemper Museum we aren't really allowed to experience this because only one person at a time is allowed to enter those structures, but when multiple people actually inhabit those structures, you sort of explore how you and your own movements impact on the movements of someone else. One step of yours will make a huge difference for someone else, and you will feel also the steps that other makes on the movements that you make yourself. Movement mobility in Saraceno's work are no longer necessarily trajectorial. They are relational. They're interdependent. They make us map and consider what's around us. They make us look forward, sideways, perhaps also backwards at once. When entering one of Saraceno's structures, we no longer perceive the motion of our own bodies and senses as being in isolation from those of others. Mobility here is no longer an issue of speed, of spatial traversal, of rational effectiveness, energized by some kind of modernist tunnel vision. In doing so, Saraceno shifts our debates about sustainability to some degree away from issues of mere structures and buildings, but to what I would like to call the ecology of our senses. How sustainable, so one of the questions that his work raises, is the way in which we see and sense the world? How sustainable do we want it to be? How can we put our senses into motion without replaying the way in which the modern culture and fetish of transportation has largely depleted our surroundings? Come to the second notion, the one of utopia. Modern utopian thought often was embedded in fantastic tales of travel. You can tell us more. Some traveler traveled somewhere to the edge of the world and found some ideal state of things, meant as a reverse image of the dire conditions at home. The result is often well known. The utopia may have looked great and enduring and fascinating, but in all its perfection and design, it often also looked utterly lifeless, deanimated, void of possibility and change. No play, no surprise, no contingency in many of the utopias of the early modern period. Much has been said about the utopian character of Saraceno's work, his eagerness to construct structures that seem to release their users from the coordinates of the here and now. I'm not always sure whether the concept of the utopian is actually entirely applicable to what he does, but his work certainly encourages us to rethink what we want and how we want to think about things utopian in the first place. Unlike Thomas More's utopia, Saraceno's is certainly not a static one frozen in time like a photographic image. It's instead charged with contingency and unpredictability. Set up like a laboratory meant to explore our own senses, our movements, our playfulness, it makes us wonder to what extent all scientific practice is driven by a certain transgressive impulse, the desire to engage and face the unpredictable. As importantly, Saraceno's work redefines the utopian not as a condition of the world, but as a way of seeing it. Rather than to understand his structures as non-spaces that reside in worlds different from ours, shouldn't we rather understand his structures as media, allowing us to see what is around us in a new key? As giant looking glasses, magnifying instruments, echo chambers, that invite us to see and sense our existing worlds in a way normally not possible. In light of Saraceno's work, mustn't we rethink the utopian as a way of looking at our world as if we no longer were affixed to it? A mode of aesthetic looking that is everything but static and ahistoric. And I conclude with some notes on sustainability. very short point. Somewhat schizophrenically, mainstream discussions about sustainability often tinged by both a certain conservatism and nostalgia, but also a certain rhetoric of sacrifice and martyrdom. We need to consume less, we are told, in order to keep going. We need to draw on alternate and less exhaustive resources in order to maintain our standard of living. Scale back, stay local, conserve and contain, and things will just turn out to be fine. Saraceno's work, I want to suggest in closing, asks us to rethink such notions of sustainability. Unless we aren't willing to reconceptualize our entire notion of physical movement and social mobility, unless we aren't willing to reconfigure how we sense and see the world and question the entire modern templates of progress, unless we don't do all of these things, our talk about sustainability will remain idle talk and simply gloss all over the real issues. It will remain talk that allows architects, engineers, city, and perhaps also campus planners to look like great innovators, but it will simply reinscribe the very logic that led to the problem we face in the first place.
Another sore throat. So I'm Brent Williams. I'm from Energy, Environmental, and Chemical Engineering. And I just thought I'd take advantage of this probably one and only opportunity in my life to put my work on display in the art school. And it's probably not something. Yeah, I go as far as stick figures as somebody could go. So I study atmospheric chemistry is my main focus, and this is sort of a sketch of what motivates this type of research. So what I've drawn here is on the left-hand side of the image is sort of the natural system, our natural planet, and on the right-hand side. These are changes that we make, and we call this anthropogenic changes to our Earth system. So I'm interested in the composition of the atmosphere. What makes up our atmosphere? So the gases and the particles that are emitted from the natural system and the anthropogenic system are what's interesting me, and the main motivation behind that is to determine the effect that we have on our climate system through changing the energy balance of our planet, and the health effects of direct exposure to these gases and particles that we inhale on a daily basis. So, in terms of the energy balance, how do our emissions change the energy of our planet? Well, we know from the last decade or so that carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions are raising the temperature of our planet. What my main focus is the particles. The particles end up being a much more complicated thing to understand about how do particles change our climate system. So we have natural particles that are emitted from trees or ocean spray or natural forest fires, grasses. These are natural particles that are emitted, gases and particles. And then we have additional gases and particles that we emit anthropogenically. So all of these gases and particles go into the atmosphere. A lot of the gases end up turning into particles eventually as they oxidize in the atmosphere. And you can't form a cloud unless you have a particle. And so we're increasing the number of particles that are in the air, and so therefore we're increasing cloud formation. We not only increase cloud formation, we increase the lifetime that clouds exist. The more particles you have, the more you spread water vapor across certain clouds, so the liquid droplets don't get large enough to fall out of the sky and rain. And so this has effects on directly affecting radiation that's coming into our planet and being reflected. Clouds are typically Generally, we consider them white, but we can, if we have cloud formation done with a power plant, it may be a darker cloud, which will actually absorb more radiation. And in terms of the hydrological cycle, normally where clouds would rain out, if we introduce a lot of particles in that area, we'll move that cloud from region A to region B, and will cause a drought where there would normally be a moderate amount of rainfall, and will cause flooding downwind from there. And so our particles are affecting where rain is falling, is affecting how much sunlight's making it to our surface or being absorbed in the atmosphere. We do understand enough to know that the net effect of particles in the atmosphere are to cool the planet. And so we've seen a huge increase in greenhouse gases, larger than has ever been recorded. The largest concentration in the last 400,000 years through 4 ice ages was about 300 parts per million of CO2. We're closer to 400 parts per million now. The temperature has not responded to that increase in CO2 like we would predict. So our current understanding is that clouds are acting, the increased cloud formation due to our particles that we're emitting are actually combating the greenhouse effect and causing a cooling effect on the planet. And so the temperature is not rising as much as you would predict based on just greenhouse gases because of our increased particle formation in the atmosphere affecting clouds and causing cooling. So in some ways, in that effect, particles in the atmosphere are a good thing, that they're combating the greenhouse gases. Well, what I've drawn down on the right-hand corner here, you see somebody standing inside a very polluted room and somebody standing outside where it's maybe not as polluted. The other thing we're concerned about with gases and particles in the atmosphere is our direct exposure and the health effects of gases and particles in the atmosphere. So in terms of health effects, we don't want gases and particles in the atmosphere. We want nice clean air to breathe. So this is an interesting thing that pollution, while our initial thought is that pollution is something that we do need to get rid of, and in general that is true, but there are things that are happening in the atmosphere that there's actually a good effect from particles. It's probably not the way to fight climate change and global warming. I think we need to work on getting our greenhouse gases down is probably a better solution, but there has been talk about what do we do in the future, what if temperatures do start to skyrocket, how do we battle that? And one way, myself as an aerosol scientist, we've been approached as what would be geoengineering solutions that we could put forth. And one thing that we talk about is putting aerosol high into the atmosphere to create a cooling effect around the planet. And there's lots of negative effects that you can imagine in terms of the long term, what happens when all this aerosol falls back to the earth and acidifies the ocean and kills life in the ocean. So, but it's a thought experiment at this point, which I think Tomás would appreciate, another atmospheric thought experiment. Just wrapping up my specific research, I do a lot of instrument development. So over on the left, that's me, that stick figure, putting together this instrument. A lot of loose wires yet, but we develop new equipment that can make measurements that have never been made before, maybe faster time resolution or different chemical species that have never been measured before. We take those in situ into the field and measure the real atmosphere, measure the Earth system, and obtain that information. We can also go into a laboratory setting down at the bottom and test individual sources at a time and characterize each individual source. Both the real life measurements and the controlled laboratory studies that information is all compiled, helps us develop our theory about particle formation and transformation in the atmosphere. And then that information is taken back. Maybe we need more lab studies and more field studies, or maybe we need a new instrument. And so this is sort of the cycle of my research in the atmosphere. So, I believe that's all I have. And in terms of how this relates to Tomás's work, I'll field a lot of those questions in terms of there are actual practical reasons why we may want a city in the sky, so we'll talk about that.
Well, since we are at a university, my talk will focus on the discussion about sustainability and the environment from the perspective of pedagogy and education, and in particular from the perspective of architectural education. The term sustainability is inseparable from the idea of the environment, and while the two words are often used interchangeably, I would propose that they potentially signify two different things, obviously using Tomás Saraceno's work as a vehicle for that discussion. I think this is particularly significant in relationship to the contemporary architectural practice, where the idea of sustainability is often synonymous with the building performance, such as the flow of energy in buildings and building systems. And the kind of work we see at the Kemper takes a slightly different approach. It actually engages social issues from the very simple perspective of inhabitation, getting into the cloud, and maybe potentially using something such as a solar cooker in that module. So in this presentation, we'll try to trace back where some of these ideas are coming from relative to education. I will begin this exploration of the environment in Saraceno's work by a quick look at his Museo Aereo Solar, a flying museum and a solar balloon completely made up of reused plastic bags, with new sections being added each time it travels the world. It is made and remade in a different community each time it lands. And so far, the Museo Solar landed in Sharjah in United Arab Emirates, in the Isola neighborhood of the city of Milan in Italy, in Medellin in Colombia, in Lyon, France, in Rapperswil in Switzerland, in Tirana, Albania, in the Ein Hod, which is the first recognized Arab village in the state of Israel, in Minneapolis, here in the Midwest, as well as in Germany, other sites in Italy, and so on. So it is basically a traveling community event that changes locations quite frequently. As it travels around the world, the museum changes techniques, drawings, and shapes, and growing in size every time it becomes airborne. As much as being an art piece, the Museo Solar is also an educational environment, for it brings together members of a community in an act of collective workshop, collective action, and an art, a do-it-together technology and experiment. This pedagogical component, communal component of Saraceno's work actually has some broader links to architectural pedagogy in particular, because two of Saraceno's greatest inspirations, in his own words, are Buckminster Fuller and Peter Cook, two very different designers, yet two people whose work is fundamentally linked to architectural production within the realm of education, pedagogy, and academia. This is a 1954 photo, actually probably approximately taken from this room where you're standing right now, before the Steinberg Hall was actually built, showing Buckminster Fuller underneath a dome made of 4-point rhombic shapes, actually very unusual for Fuller because most of his domes were triangulated geodesic domes. Fuller taught at Washington University in the 1950s, but also at other schools. It was in Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, and I just learned that Professor Buzz Spector was one of his assistants in 1970, right? As well as the Black Mountain College and so on. His work was somewhat polemical because he was both hailed as one of self-made pioneers of modern innovation and modern design. Yes, he was also a consultant to the military-industrial complex in the context of the Cold War, and in particular the U.S. military. And obviously, in that he was not alone, because most other architectural practitioners had some kind of similar connections as well. As an educator, Fuller was inspired by the scientific progress, the new materials, the new technologies, but his studio teaching was also interesting because it combined a form of scientific experimentation with more intuitive design models. He and his students made prototypes for cars, structures, domes, and houses, constantly testing their structural features and ability to weather the elements and so on. In essence, this form of education was an antidote to a formal curricular academic model, like an early form of what we call today maybe design build, perhaps reflecting the lack of Fuller's own academic credentials. A model that only to a certain degree was scientific, but more so improvisational and intuitive. This form of hands-on approach is very much replicated in Saraceno's own work. in his own studio work, where his studio space looks more like a lab, albeit a messy one, I might add, where new types and prototypes are constantly being made and remade. Saraceno tests his modules in the backyard of his studio in Frankfurt through a performance evaluation, because as much as a scientific evaluation as it is a public spectacle that people from the neighborhood can actually participate in. Speaking of spectacle, I would like to introduce Saraceno's second major inspiration, which is Peter Cook, who was his architecture professor at the Städelschule in Frankfurt on Main, where Saraceno completed his graduate studies in architecture in early 2000s. Saraceno constantly praises Cook's teaching method, which is highly discursive and polemical, where he's asking students to find their own way to design and resist the dominant forms of professional practice. I should add that Cook's professional work is closely tied to education. He co-founded the Archigram Group in the 1960s, and they used the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London as their base for nearly 4 decades, both for teaching but also for distributing pamphlets about their architecture, including the iconic Archigram magazine in the 1960s. Archigram's architectural projects such as the Instant City, displayed here on the screen from 1968, were speculative research ideas that explored the possibility of new technologies and mass media to generate new architecture. The Instant City, for example, was a traveling idea circus that injected metropolitan dynamic into rural areas through different types of events, such as concerts, projections of newspaper magazines onto different types of inflatable balloons, and so on. But the so-called institutionalization of Archigram and their ideas in architectural culture was truly carried out not through their projects, which for most part were actually not built, or for all part, I should say, but through their work in architectural education. Peter Cook and other members of the Archigram Group were or still are very influential architectural educators. Alvin Boyarsky, a noted academic and leader in the United Kingdom, gave them the platform at the Architectural Association, as I mentioned, and in 1972, Archigram ran what was called a Manhattan workshop as a part of Boyarsky's improvised summer school called the International Institute of Design. The topic of the summer workshop was to redesign or reappropriate a site for the old ComEd power plant in Manhattan, which became defunct in the late 1960s. For that summer workshop, Archigram prepared the briefing document represented here on the slide, which collected not only the empirical data about the site, such as planning information and so on, but also a number of popular ephemera, including random stories by residents in the neighborhood, newspaper clips, video recordings of the site, in order to provide a fairly diverse and comprehensive vision of this particular environment. For such work, we have the emergence of a new environmental issues, obviously a brownfield site with obvious post-industrial concerns framed by the energy concerns of the early 1970s. Yet we also have an emergent concept of the environment that is also tied to social networks, to multiple voices, and ultimately to design, because the purpose of the Manhattan workshop was to actually suggest several design proposals for the site itself. Brief notes from the document speak about the residents of the vertical cities, the so-called vertical cities, Chicago and New York, where residents of high skyscrapers, where their lives are closely intertwined with daily operations of mechanical devices such as air conditioning units, elevators, and so on, all the machinery that makes the living possible on the, let's say, 95th floor of the Hancock Tower in the city of Chicago. And in this, we see this sort of hybridized notion of the idea of the environment that is both something that's both natural and also man-made. In speaking of the premise of the Archigram, Peter Cook captured this sense of the environment by saying that many young architects at that time, and students, were dissatisfied by the professional practice of architecture, and this is a quote, with reasons that were the result of an increasing awareness of the environment, that this idea became really pressing in the early 1970s, and that's what basically set the agenda for the Archigram and similar types of groups. In his book, Experimental Architecture, Peter Cook wrote, "We cannot ignore perhaps the most important development of the last decade, man's race towards space. One typical byproduct of space technology is a building made from a plastic which will grow when exposed to the air. End quote. An obvious reference to something that today we can see in the form of Airport City. Tomás Saraceno's Airport City, and here's an image from 2004, gives a palpable vision to this desire, comprising a series of drifting bubbles suspended in the air above the vast Venetian lagoon. This is a Venetian iteration of the Airport City in addition to our own St. Louis version here. Filled with people, the bubbles are in a state of flux. They constantly shift and regroup, migrating from the monumental steps of the Santa Lucia train station towards the city's scattered islands. Echoing Venice's own fluid boundary between the ground and the water, the Airport City is a place in between and beyond any established territory. A city above a city that constantly drifts in the Adriatic's crisp air. It echoes a view from the air of Archigram's Manhattan workshop briefing document where clouds in the city form a single dreamlike image, where the horizon line is completely blurred and erased. This elusive horizon reminds me of Martin Heidegger's borrowing of the original Greek word orismos, for horizon, and quote, "A boundary is not that at which something stops, but as the Greeks recognized, the boundary is that from which something begins its presence. Orismos, or the horizon in Greek, or the marking out with a boundary, surrounds tenderly what is looked upon," end quote. In that, Heidegger suggested a very fluid, very fuzzy notion of horizon. This elusive notion of horizon is in line with Saraceno's own rejection to describe this visionary image, for we are left with no clues about the actual building program and function for these drifting bubbles. It is really up to us as users of these images to build their meaning and improvise the program through use and experimentation, in the same way that we can bounce on top of the big air pillow in the cloud module at the Kemper Art Museum. But one possible legacy of this work could be its relentless hybridization of the term environment. As we look at these images of Tomás Saraceno Flying Garden, we are puzzled by the mechanization of nature and the naturalization of the machine. On the left side is a version of Saraceno's Flying Garden from the Sudley Castle in England from 2006. A crossover between nature and culture, where nature drifts as a balloon in the wind, filled with tillandsia plants that can survive only on rainwater and sun. Here, the environment is both what is within the bubble and what is outside, a drifting image floating up high above. On the right side is another iteration of the Flying Garden from 2007, made of plastic pillows with pressurized air, webbing covered with black felt, grass, solar flexible panels, electrical cables, battery, solar pump, and a water supply system. A natural robot, if you wish, that deeply questions assumptions about the environment as a purely natural phenomenon. This hybridization is ingrained in Saraceno's own philosophy, and this is a quote from Saraceno. "Humans and nature are not separate territories. People are part of a complex system," he said and continued. In his ecosophy, the so-called ecosophy, Felix Guattari describes our world as an entity in which the social, environmental, and mental worlds are inextricably interwoven, end quote. What I try to argue here today is that the hybridization of the term environment was in part made possible by Saraceno's exposure to the forms of architectural education that were discursive and experimental, such as in the case of Cook or Fuller. Both of these sources were rooted in architectural pedagogy, which allowed experimentation that was perhaps not possible in the context of a professional architectural practice. The educational studio space became a lab for experimentation, to use the scientific metaphor, blurring all distinctions between an architectural office, a school, a gallery, and a lab bench. One result of that pedagogical crossover is the emergence of the idea of the environment, including in the recent work of Saraceno, where environment is engaged as a true but also problematic and unresolved merger of technology, nature, and culture. Thank you very much. I would like to invite now all the members of the panel and to come forward, and also Professor Eric Mumford to join us for the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you again to Meredith and Igor for setting all this up and inviting me to be a respondent. I feel a little overwhelmed, I have to admit, by all of this, and I'm not sure exactly what sort of response is most constructive. I think that we've heard a lot of very interesting responses to the work, and it certainly seems in line with the current effort to really begin to start a dialogue between science, art, design, in a context that's relatively rare. I mean, only in universities do you have this possibility, really, of these people from these different fields really having this kind of an interchange. So I think just at that level, I'd like to very much validate this event as maybe an early kind of experimental effort in that direction. Obviously, it's very difficult to talk across disciplines, as we've heard. It's not a simple conversation. I think Saraceno's work is provocative in a sense, in that it immediately raises a question, at least for me, of why this sort of sudden, you could basically say, revival of the utopian visions of the 1960s. And I think in that it's very much in line with a lot of current, and really over the last 10 years, concerns in architecture, where movements like archigram, figures like Buckminster Fuller, Metabolists in Japan, these have been very extensively looked at again, and in fact have been very inspiring for a lot of contemporary practitioners, including some right here on our own faculty, like Sun Ho Kim and Heather Woofter. So I think there's that element to Saraceno's work, but there's also, I think, a temptation maybe to say, why? That the work has already been done. Do we need to redo Buckminster Fuller? We can just go look at Buckminster Fuller's work. And in fact, there's all kinds of interesting exhibitions and all kinds of sort of retrospectives about that sort of work that have been happening all over the world. But I think what's interesting really about Saraceno, and the panel I think kind of brings that to light, is that there's also, in a way, a problem with this utopianism. That utopianism is very linked in the 60s to science and to a kind of optimistic sense of possibility for science that really came into very serious question in the late 60s. And a lot of that having to do, I think, with the very strongly politically charged dimensions of technology and science in the 20th century, some of which we heard about last night in the context of World War II and so on, that there's a kind of a sense that technology is not neutral, that it's something that's highly motivated, it's often secretive, that there's a dimension of these kinds of projects that often calls to mind, as certainly Fuller's work does, military applications, which in many cases were in fact very real. And not to say those were all bad military applications, but nonetheless, there is something sometimes that seems maybe a bit naive to just see it as only a kind of sort of optimistic vision, really not linked to any kind of larger agenda of power of some kind. So I think that that's a question that Saraceno is I think, aware of, and I think his work is deliberately intended to kind of make those questions come to mind. And I think that it then ties into this question of sustainability, is can we have a sort of vision of sustainability that's not connected directly to a particular politics, whether socialist or otherwise. And I think those are questions that really need to be thought about in terms of these kinds of projects. And I thought the individual presentations all raised very interesting questions that made me very aware of the value really of scientific research relative perhaps to that of the humanities, that certainly I can't talk about how you can get rid of selenium from soil, or how the particles in the atmosphere are causing major transformations of human life. And it's quite really daunting and sobering to see that that's the kind of work that's going on and certainly needs to be strongly supported. I also thought that Lutz, Koepnick, and Igor Marjanovic both, in different ways, raised interesting historical questions about Saraceno's work, and I won't repeat those because I think their presentations really raised those very clearly and interestingly. I thought that this idea of mobility that Lutz brought up is really an interesting concept that in the earlier 20th century had a very simplistic almost kind of sense of this movement from A to B. That's something that Saraceno's work really does try to engage with, and this idea that maybe you can travel in a sense without moving, and that utopia doesn't necessarily have to be based on this idea of taking yourself halfway across the world. There might be other kinds of mobility that his projects, I think, really try to cause one to think about. And similarly, I think that Igor is very detailed invoking of Fuller and Peter Cook strongly shows how Saraceno's work grows directly out of those inspirations, which Saraceno himself is quite explicit about, that Fuller especially, I think, is a major source of inspiration. So overall, I would say it was very intellectually stimulating, hopefully the first step toward further discussions of this kind. I don't think I can really make any larger conclusion about it. So I think now we can really maybe begin questions for the panel. So anybody want to start? Lutz?
Well, Eric, you talked a little bit about, you asked this question. Can we have a vision of sustainability not connected to a particular politics? And it seems to me that Joseph deals all the time with political issues because your research on plants leads you inevitably to the edges of the genetically modified plant political opposition. How do you deal with that? How do you get people to...
Yeah, that's actually, I sidestep it because technically I'm not dealing with food. I'm dealing with a material. And it's interesting because, we have no problem wearing genetically modified cotton. Almost everyone in this room probably is wearing something which has had genes put in there to defend against insect resistance. So, and actually people who do a lot of work in terms of thinking about biomaterials and biofuels, there are environmental regulatory issues, but then other safety issues never apply. But it's when you start thinking about food that comes into play. So I've actually managed to avoid most of the political aspect, but I've actually become much more aware in my own interactions as I've become more of a plant biologist thinking about these problems. It's hard because you do have to walk a fine line. As a scientist, I know the data. There are risks, but those risks are very minor and they're very specific to certain populations, certain people. I mean, in many ways, we've been doing genetically modified organisms since we harvested corn, since we put the first tomato into the field. Everything that we've done, we've been genetically modifying livestock, dogs, right? You name it, we've been manipulating it for 10,000 years. And it's just that now you have a question of using technology to be a little more targeted in how you do it. And the companies that deal with that are very aware of these political issues. And it is a fight because ultimately, this gets sort of sustainability of agriculture and environmental systems. When you're facing the challenge of feeding the next billion mouths with what you have when you're in the farmlands or reclaiming marginal soils and territories, you have to pull out every tool that's available to you if you're going to meet those challenges. But explaining the science in a way that's not frightening becomes a very major issue and challenge.
Thanks.
Can I ask you a question there? Can we sort of go back?
Yeah.
When we as humanists or as philosophers or as critics sort of more in the humanities start to, like Igor did earlier, sort of trying to talk about the naturalization of the machine and the machinization of nature, and we're still trying to sort of figure out how we can conceptually define that and maybe draw borders that are then being transgressed. Is it just an old head food? I mean, is this still relevant to be done?
I think it is because we have to, as humans, we've been changing. If we're not changing, we're not being human. Mm-hmm. And we always need to be sort of the idea of the boundaries, right? This idea of we need to be always thinking about where these boundaries are. And, technologically, we can do lots of things. Thinking about Buckminster Fuller and those designs, right? But those same designs are now carbon nanoparticles in terms of materials. And it really gets to the ability of whether or not we have the political wisdom to know how we use the technologies that we have. I'm an optimist, right? You can be very pessimistic about it where, GMOs or technology are going to rule the world, and they can. Well, not GMOs, technology. Right? There's a lot of there's actually more important things to worry about than technology that's scary. But, you can also use those as tools help, as long as you're rational and measured and thoughtful about how you apply those tools. I think humanity is sort of the dialogue. It's like sort of sometimes as reductionists, we tend to ignore certain things, but you need to be reminded that there's outside implications.
holding.
Angela?
Well, I mean, in response to what you just said, I mean, who was we? I guess the question that this raises for me is in relation to genetically engineered seeds and agriculture has to do with who commands the technology, who manipulates it, who distributes it, and who profits from it, and how it's used. And it seems to me that your very interesting statement didn't really address that issue, that there's a kind of collective universal we that unfolds those kinds of very direct and hugely immediate questions that we're facing. So, I mean, I guess to take it to the next step in relation to Saraceno, I think that Eric asked the key question, which is, the question of can you have a sustainability without a political program of some kind? And so who's to say that Saraceno isn't the R&D branch of some kind of new, formidable new form of military industrial technology? That he's not, there's this kind of naive quality about his presentation and about his work that seems to me to dodge all of the most difficult questions in relation to how these utopian ideas are being exploited and used and potentially utilized for very different kinds of purposes. So I guess that it's a question about how can you have, how do these ideas operate without some sort of larger social or political context in which they operate. Whimsy's great, utopia's great, but these seems to me it's completely free floating.
But in a way, it's so free floating that it almost raises the
Literally
question.
free floating.
There was a question back here.
Well, wait,
Oh, sorry.
I want to hear the big
Maybe I can start and I think others can join in. One thing that I think is, you raise a really valid point, and I think that Saraceno is very careful to not to go into the territory, so to speak. He tries to speak from a very experiential perspective of being a user of these modules and simply enjoying being in the clouds. There is the underlying, I think, political note in his work, because if you look at the Museo Iowa Solar, the locations are Sharjah, Palestine, Switzerland. There is a certain sort of political contextual, sort of political tension in places that he chooses to play, many in Colombia. So there is a sense of political tension in all the places that that he's engaging his work, that he's also maybe trying to ease with the idea of a transnational displacement as a way to sort of escape some of the political tensions of a local condition. So the work is very much driven, I think, by this experience of being away from any kind of national or political borders, and I think that's the kind of a underlying political tone, which is and maybe it's a form of escapism, or sort of escaping away into the clouds and sort of closing your eyes in face of the politics. But I think a lot of it comes from his own lived experience. We touched upon a little bit, but he was born in Argentina. Very quickly, when he was, I think, a year old, his family moved to Italy because of the coup d'etat in Argentina and political oppression. He has an Italian father and a German mother. He sort of spent some time in Italy, then he moved back to Argentina when he finished his architectural school. Then he went to Germany for his graduate school. Even when I asked him about, Tomás, how exactly do you pronounce your last name? He said, well, I refuse to give the exact pronunciation because it doesn't make any sense. I'm the citizen of the entire planet Earth, and of course that's another reference to Buckminster Fuller and the sort of the spaceship Earth as like the homeland for people. So in a sense, I think it speaks to that kind of constant drifting displacement, and that's probably the best that I could pinpoint in terms of the social condition that he's trying to tackle in his work. If others want to add something.
Okay, this is kind of a question for the whole panel. You've very established the similarities between now and the '60s and that whole there's just many common thoughts and trends repeat guys are of academic credibility, which is what of extreme academic credibility, which some artists and don't have the support of. And I guess what I'm asking is, what are you guys going to do, or are you guys going to do anything to make sure that this isn't just an artistic trend? And do you think that your individual studies can synthesize the same things that this one person has synthesized, and continue this as a future, not just a trend?
Yeah, so I guess what I think of in my field of atmospheric science, how this could be relevant. There are practical reasons you may want to escape the surface of our planet, even for a period of time. It could be meteor strike or large volcanic eruptions, or our atmosphere is built in a way that there's a protective layer at anywhere between the first 200 meters to the first mile of the atmosphere is sort of a protective layer, and that's where all of our pollution goes. So if we overpollute our planet, or release some sort of maybe nuclear fallout or some toxic chemicals we need to escape from, there could be practical reasons we may want to get above the atmosphere, or the planetary boundary layer is what it's called, for periods of time. So in my research, there's, as I think about this, there are reasons we would want to continue on, pull from these ideas. I don't know, there's lots of, as an engineer, there are lots of challenges that we would face in trying to make this happen in biology, food production in the sky. I'll let Joseph comment on that if you'd like. But in the same way that I mentioned about climate change, that we're being approached currently, what do we do if our temperature starts to skyrocket on our planet? What are we going to do? Maybe we seed our atmosphere with particles. This would be another sort of engineering approach to escape future harsh conditions that may present itself on the surface. That's my comment.
Actually, I wanted to redirect the question to Lutz. You said something totally marvelous about Saraceno's work, that mobility is relational therein. And it resonated for me with my reading of Nicholas Bourriaud's Relational Aesthetics. Something Bourriaud didn't say, how social relations were affected by the kinds of curatorial practices he was engaged with in his book. But this notion of play as relational seems to enter into Saraceno's work a lot. And it enters, I think, into your own thinking about the play of forces in culture. I was hoping you'd speak a little bit more about play, mobility, and cultural force in Saraceno.
Thanks for that question. I mean, it's great, and we'll probably take a pretty long and wide answer to sort of untangle all the elements that would feed into a definition of art and play. But I find that utterly important about his work, that it sort of opens up this space where we can play and experience our bodies and senses in ways we wouldn't in sort of an everyday space. And start there. And I wasn't necessarily, Bourriaud was sort of somewhere maybe in the background, but I didn't really want to go that route when mentioning the word relational. I think I was on a much less sort of ambitious level there, just really talking the way in which bodies come to, in a playful mode, come to interact and recognize and sort of reckon with each other in these kind of installations he sets up for us. Sort of being on these air pockets, basically, where we feel each other in ways we would normally not recognize each other. That is sort of a way that really makes us reconsider our sense of our bodily boundaries, our sort of bodily sense of motion, our sort of bodily interactions. And that happens sort of in a space, and maybe that goes back a bit also to Angela's question, and I think I'll come back to that question as well in that respect. Sort of the politics that are being involved. I mean, doesn't Saraceno needs this kind of almost extraterrestrial space in order to invite us to that kind of experience and practice? sort of the question that came earlier, what do we do as academics? Aren't we sort of in an extraterrestrial space too, to some degree, where we actually ponder over those kind of issues? Well, in the hope that they will have some kind of long-term effect and move out of here. And sort of aren't we, maybe not so much in the sciences, because I guess according to the sort of normal assumption, you guys have a direct impact on what's out there in the world, whereas we're just sort of talking about it.
Sometimes we're just talking.
Well, that's good to know. But I mean, in so many ways, I mean, isn't a space like this one here as well, our seminar space is in a way cloud structures where we probe thoughts somewhat emancipated from direct cultural forces and political imperatives. But we need that kind of space off in order to actually develop this kind of ideas. And so I'm a little hesitant, therefore, also to sort of come back to Angela's question, to say, oh, it's a utopian, and he doesn't think about the political sort of mutability and usability of this kind of thing, because where we need that space too in order to actually probe this up. So I really see sort of where you want to go with the comment, but I think in a way, sort of, not just art, but actually academia does that all the time.
So for me, intrinsically tied to the political question is the economic question. And so, I mean, the way I see it is we're all here by virtue of the fact that we're in a market economy, and the market economy allows us to do this. I mean, we're all sort of, we can't understand architecture without the market economy. At least we can't understand architecture now, and I'm sure that applies to everybody's professions here. And I'm not sure if there are economists in the house in this room right now, but I guess my question is, if we're all a product of a market economy, which, more specifically is a consumption-based economy, can we consume our way into a quote-unquote sustainable future? Meaning, is consumption, is perpetuating this consumption the way to some sort of reconciliation between our lifestyles and lack of depletion of natural resources, and ultimately the future of humanity? So this is a panel-wide question.
I think you can opt to not answer certain questions. Actually, I think I would like to address the question because I think it speaks about sort of inherent contradiction that I've hinted in talking about Fuller, for example, relative to the sort of the military-industrial complex and so on. But one of the critiques of this work is that basically you can also read it as an exaggeration or acceleration of the consumption, because the idea of travel and displacement is so much driven by consumption, by mass tourism, cars, airplanes, you name it. All of it is tied to sort of market economy and consumption. And I think it's a problematic aspect of the work that could be read in many different ways. We haven't talked about this, for example, but there's a lot of plastic used in the work, which is another problematic consumption we are facing, which is also related to the environmental issues. And I know, for example, that in our discussion with Tomás, they're actually trying to experiment with different types of materials that they can use that wouldn't be necessarily as sort of oppressive to the environment as plastic is. But a lot of these bubbles right now are made of plastic. So there are contradictions, and I think economy is one of them, but also material production and how it all works is another one. The module was made in Frankfurt and shipped on an airplane across the globe, consuming energy and increasing carbon footprint. But again, it's an issue that we can be critical of. Tomás speaks a lot about how it can operate, how that kind of work can operate, for example, in the community, free of charge, which I think why the Museo Solar is a very dear project to him, because it's a very spontaneous project, but at the same time, most of the other projects are driven by commissions and museums as sort of cultural institutions that are cultural, but also driven by issues of commodity and consumption as well.
Can I add one thing? Can I add one thing to that?
Sure, yeah.
I mean, sort of, think you're quite right in many respects. I mean, I'd say, if we continue to live in a society, in a culture, in a civilization that measures progress by the building of manifest structures, that measures progress in terms of how much we are able to traverse given spaces and thereby destroy them, if we continue to live the way we do it right now, where we can only think of sort of speeding up of the economy in terms of, say, how much the housing market is going to pick up speed and more houses are being built, if those are the parameters according to which we want to match progress or measure progress, we're not getting ever anywhere that would be called sustainability. I think sort of we can't, sort of the claim I wanted to make is that sort of sustainability needs to be thought in categories other than the ones that we have right now by which we measure progress of this society. And yeah, maybe that's sort of an anti-capitalist message I'm saying here, but I'll leave that up to you.
Okay, Sabina, did you have a question?
Mm-hmm.
No.
I don't know if I have really a question or maybe just an idea. I'm just wondering in how far we could not understand Tomás Saraceno as not being interdisciplinary whatsoever. More the absolute opposite, maybe that he's the most, as far as I know right now, radical form of self-realization of an artist, because everything he does has no function and no purpose. And so basically he's like really this, you know, living his passions, and he's getting into the NASA, and he gets all these scientists to do what he envisions. And he gets to, you know, talk to spider researchers, and they really work for him until they have found out a way of how to realize a 3D model of the spider web, and that has never been done before. But it doesn't serve any purpose, and it doesn't really enhance, you know, there's not...
Well, except that it does seem to suggest...
I'm not finished.
It just seems to...
But what he does in the process, and that's maybe, is that he gets people to talk to each other, and that he creates dialogues, and that we do things together. And that is maybe the moment of utopia in the here and now. So utopia is not one which is future-directed, but which comes out of that radical form of self-realization through which we all of a sudden get entangled like on a playground and start to interact socially.
Yeah.
Just as an idea.
Well, also,
this is maybe the
yeah, I think maybe that is it. And also, it seems like there's the getting the scientists interested in how these ideas are represented, which, you know, further evidence. I mean, that seems to me like a very positive aspect of it. So it doesn't seem only like self-realization in that sense.
I don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and maybe I'm looking at it through, you know, as a convert to Saraceno's way of thinking, but I do think it's not just a one, at least, and ideally, it's not just a one-sided thing. It's not just him getting something from these scientists. I mean, he does, at least, you know, it may be a rare thing, but it actually does, these conversations do help these scientists to think outside of what their, you know, their immediate kind of purpose is, and to think in sort of maybe more creative ways. Like the spider scientists never thought of putting, you know, trying to do a three-dimensional spider web, but now that leads to different, he's coordinating with another scientist to think about proposing an experiment to put these spiders in space and to experiment with, you know, three-dimensional spiders in anti-gravity. So, I mean, this isn't always the case, but I do think, you know, that I think you're right that utopian moment, it does come out of, you know, the discourses that he engages with, or that we then engage with amongst ourselves as we experience these works too.
So actually, from a scientific perspective, if you think about the idea of undirected research versus directed research, you know, we live in a political environment where we'll give you $1 million if you can prove to us that what you're going to research is going to have a benefit for society. And which is kind of, it's wrong, because the idea, so for example, the National Institutes of Health began in the 50s with the idea of the best science selecting itself and not being driven in any real way, but sort of to be very, almost like a spider web, you know, sort of random. But that as people explore different directions, somebody else might say, aha, that's something that we can use. And this idea of this unintended effect and how it ripples across different fields really becomes valuable. A great example is a jellyfish protein called green fluorescent protein. So, if you sort of look at the ocean, you'll sometimes see jellyfish that'll fluoresce at night. Okay, that's cool, right? Whatever. But that gene that encodes that protein is now one of the most valuable tools in cell biology, molecular biology, because you can put that green fluorescent protein onto another protein, and then in the microscope you can watch where it goes. You can start to see organizations. And actually, the guy that discovered the green fluorescent protein never had NIH funding. In fact, he was basically denied tenure because he had a crazy idea. And ultimately, it became one of the most valuable pieces of scientific, in the kit that's used currently. And he actually goes around talking about how you shouldn't direct research. You should actually have this almost utopian idea about ideas colliding and coming together to actually bring about advancements in fields. Sort of that goes back to that clouds kind of bumping into each other.
And I think also this comment, I think the previous one also bring a bigger question about what research actually is, and on the other hand, what is interdisciplinary research. And I'll start with the latter because oftentimes there is a confusion about how to conduct interdisciplinary research, because it seems that you almost need to dumb down your own disciplinary research field to present it to another discipline, and establishing those bridges is very difficult. And I think that's something that Tomás is always sort of finding in his own work, how to sort of speak to these different scientists and how they can speak to him. You almost need to find a new common language. And it's actually interesting. You see Suzanne is here from iCares. When you go to iCares seminars where you have architects, biologists, sociologists talking to each other, it is really interesting because you almost need to find a new language for your research that has a much bigger audience. On the other hand, I think speaking maybe from my own discipline, such as the discipline of architecture, the research has changed. I mean, there was a period in the 60s and 70s where there was architectural research as almost equivalent to scientific research. We had foundations, we had even corporations who actually sponsored research, funded applied research in the way that scientific research is conducted. So many schools, including our school, had a solar simulation lab or acoustical labs. In particular in England in the 1960s, every school had a number of 5 to 7 building technology labs that were externally funded. Over time, all those funding sources drained out. They pretty much don't exist, in Europe at least, anymore, because most corporations switched to a model of just recycling whatever knowledge they have and putting it into existing types of designs. I don't want to speak for the scientists, but I'm sure that they can say what was the level of funding 10 years ago and what is the level of funding today. You can read in the papers every day that Pfizer, for example, closed most of their research and development facilities, not only in the US, but also in England. So I think whole R&D complex will be changing. I think not only will it change in artificial already, but I think it will change in other fields. And I think the level of support that we saw maybe 10 years ago, I don't think it will be there anymore. And I think that will be another obstacle for conducting research, not only that's interdisciplinary, but also very, very disciplinary research.
I think we had, another question?
I don't need to exhaust the panel. And some of the things have been already mentioned. But two artists come to mind as a kind of an opposition to Saraceno's vision. Mildred and his revival field, very old example of activist approach towards the land. And Francis Alice, sometimes poetic things are political and sometimes political things are poetic. And if you remember the piece. And I wonder, so on the one hand, I think Igor, you mentioned that the great things come from the borderline, the horizon, the blurry boundary between, let's say, science and art, or sky and earth. But my fear, going back to Lutz, is that when we are playing, we're involved with the homo ludens, playground as artists and even academics and scientists sometimes. That's when we are very safe, because we do not touch the systems. So going back to Baz's question about the politics of it all, my utopian dream would be, or desire, how can we as artists touch this ground again, not to be in that bubble, the extraterrestrial, the other, and go back to be involved and to mess up the system a little bit and make it productive. So I think it's a question open-ended to everybody, but especially to the left and right side of the table.
Here on the right.
Silence is an answer too. A strong one.
I'm thinking about whether I should say something which probably brings me into trouble about interdisciplinarity. But it's sort of maybe the moment to mention that as well. I mean, sort of the assumption that has been built in recent years into our lives as academics in particular, that everything that is meaningful and everything that is good and everything that is productive only and almost only happens at the borders between disciplines or in the kind of interdisciplinary work that is going on. And one can probably extend that to funding practices right now. At this university, for instance, any kind of competitive fellowship that is being put out by the administration will probably ask you to put in something interdisciplinarily together, which has sort of resulted in a kind of, I don't want to say fetishization of the interdisciplinarity, but it really has sort of also resulted in a kind of draining of disciplinarity, as if sort of any work that is being done within a discipline is dull, boring, and not ever anything new. And I don't know, sort of, Sabine, when you earlier talked about sort of this self-realization is not interdisciplinarity, I said, yeah, so what? Maybe it's good, you know?
But it wouldn't be necessarily mean
Right,
it
I know.
at all,
Yeah,
because that would
yeah.
be the moment where I could
Right,
actually
right.
then locate utopia.
Yeah.
So,
No, but I think it's sort of, I see that, you know, but I think that's sort of a counterweight to the situation, and I wonder whether sort of Saraceno makes us think about that as well in so many ways. What is actually interdisciplinarity? And I cannot actually answer that question with regard to art, and I almost had this question I wanted to ask you. I mean, what does it actually mean to be an interdisciplinary artist? And that would be sort of something for me to ask. But for me, I drifted away from the question, so I'll give it over to the right for now.
You know, it's interesting. I think it's for me, it's a sort of a double perspective. I think part of it, I think, to extend your comment about interdisciplinarity and funding, I think in the era of diminished funding, it's one of the ways to sort of pull the funding together and sort of spread the wealth. So I think there is a pragmatic impulse behind some of the interdisciplinary prompts, despite the proclaimed rhetoric. I would maybe add, in relationship to maybe art and architecture in particular, what is interesting about sort of being on the boundary, on that sort of fuzzy edge, is that it takes architects and artists into the field in the way that they were not there before. And I'm specifically referring to the work of Meredith that you showed, Meredith, in your presentation, who is an artist working in the field, in the community, experimenting with materials, and doing work that's maybe not necessarily scientific in its nature, but it's related to the context that goes beyond the academia or beyond the museum, beyond sort of received cultural norms that historically as artists and as architects were dealt with. And I think that's, again, on the positive side of this sort of interdisciplinary leap, is that kind of reaching out. And sometimes it's really driven by the, if one could say, lack of commissions, by the mainstream institutions that sort of prompt these people to go out in the field and experiment. Saraceno was disappointed by his opportunities to practice architecture. He graduated in Buenos Aires at the moment when the entire economy of Argentina collapsed. There was simply no work for architects, and he went to Germany to graduate school. So again, it goes back to the economy, but also it has interesting consequences for work in the field.
I think we have some more questions.
Can I just say one thing? I just want to,
Yes.
it's more just a side comment to what Igor was saying. I mean, but a work like this dry toilet, though, is hardly without its complications, though, when you're talking about, you know, that she'll go out into the communities, right? And she'll, you know, either work or live with the community for a while, and she talks about it as this kind of urgent architecture that she's creating. But it does come back into the art gallery, and like it's that coming back. Sometimes it can become really problematic, or at least more complicated. What I showed you was two images, and the one was actually the toilet in situ, and the other one was her recreation of it in the gallery. And so. And then when she recreates them, it's not exactly like the original architectural piece. She'll use kind of materials that she finds in the wherever that gallery is. You know, she'll build it anew in that space. So it becomes almost like a sculpture. So it's taking, you know, looking at this kind of outside architecture and this needs in these communities, and then, you know, addressing that, but then turning it back into the art gallery in some kind of a sculptural, more commodified fashion to just draw some questions.
Can I add one more thing? I think that brings me back also to the question. I mean, really, I mean, in that respect, I mean, does he build really alternate structures that we sort of can enjoy and play with in their own terms? Is it sort of another dream reality somehow? Is it really that detached utopia? I don't know enough about Saraceno, but sort of my approach to the work was to not see it as sort of a toying with alternate structures that just lead us out of what we have here, and maybe correct me if I'm totally wrong on this, but more see it as, I guess, the medium, a looking glass, that maybe from that other point allows us to sort of see and sense things differently, that also has something to do with our real world. And if that kind of intervention, I guess, isn't also a political intervention, then I'm not sure I know what political might mean in art, you know. I'm not sure I'm right with that interpretation of his work, but to see these not just as alternate structures, but actually as media, actually, you know, things that reframe our look at what's not up there, but down here, you know. It would be my suggestion, but might be off there.
I think we're getting close to the end here. I know we had one or two more questions. No, I think you were first. Okay. Yeah. Meredith?
Yeah, I'd be interested if any of the panel thinks that Saraceno is at all interested in or has anything to offer us on the question of population growth, population distribution. You know, I mean, most, and you Joseph, did mention this briefly, but I think most scientists suggest that population is a major determinant of sustainability. So it's just looking at the work, do you find any connection there between this pressing issue and the work itself?
Oh, a short comment on it. I mean, so in terms of population growth, I mean, you still have this, you have the same amount of resources, but you have more people fighting over that set amount of resources. So in that sense, I think it doesn't, it's not an immediate first order solution to expand our living space, if that's maybe the question there. But in terms of going back to a couple comments I had earlier, that in terms of sustainability, in terms of a healthy environment, there may be it may be a solution in terms of healthier living spaces potentially. Short comments.
Yes. Seems like a good place to stop. Maybe any more questions? Yeah.
For the atmospheric canvas, it seemed like at least your presentation was a lot more about the observing of the atmosphere. And as an architecture student, it was interesting that you said that our CO2 production turned sort of this atmosphere into more like a particles sort of material kind of thing. And it's also interesting that you took a very optimistic view of our creation of the CO2 to say, well, maybe it wouldn't be so bad if we just kind of had these opportunities to lift up off of the Earth's surface and into this atmosphere. Maybe it would be better for us and the Earth in that kind of way. So it's nice because you sort of, instead of looking at this at the installation as a utopia idea, you almost are trying to validate it as like a practical solution to like real world problems. I also was interested in, as a chemist, if you see this particles or your sort of atmospheric studies, and I know we're relating to like actual building architecture. Are you excited about architecture at all in relation to with atmosphere control for like you mentioned. But I just wondered if that was
Yeah, so maybe just briefly on your latter comment there. I have been getting more and more interested in indoor air quality, and that certainly plays into architecture. And there's even building materials like coating walls with titanium dioxide so that you break down toxic chemicals. And that's definitely plays into the type of work that I'm interested in doing. In terms of having a positive outlook on our future, in terms of our habitable, or how likely the likelihood that we can stay put on the ground. I guess that's trying to have a positive spin on the lack of progress we've made politically at having any changes. But there's definitely things being done in terms of reusing carbon dioxide to get our carbon dioxide levels down, carbon sequestration, putting it into biomass, other things. Another part of the positive spin is I think I definitely have a crazy mind a little bit, and I would have a lot of fun working on this type of thing with Tomás and actually trying to put this in practice and pretend above a lake with Tomás someday. So I would encourage this type of exploration.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks to everyone, and